Joanna McGrenere is a professor in the Department of Computer Science here at UBC, and is also an INRIA and Université de Paris Sud International Research Chair. Joanna received a PhD from the University of Toronto, a master's from UBC, and a bachelor's from Western University, all in computer science. Her broad research area is human-computer interaction with a specialization in interface personalization, universal usability, assistive technology, and computer-supported cooperative work. Joanna is a core member at DFP and has helped lead the curriculum development for both our fundamentals and project course. So far, she has had 6 students in the Create grad training program and has taught the fundamentals and been involved as a mentor in the project course. Joanna gave a talk at DFP's second downtown salon in Robson Square on designing inclusive technology and systems. And she's also part of our Prismine Lab initiative and was one of the first faculty to take a lead last January. She's a central part of DFP and in general, just a lovely person to work with. So with that, please join me in welcoming Joanna.
Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction, Jocelyn. So I'm going to share my screen here and see if I can get the right screen. I'm not sure, Jocelyn, if your slides were actually advancing.
Oh no, sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure if other people, other people saw that. It's a recent problem with Zoom. So are you seeing my slide now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let me know if it doesn't seem to be moving forward, and we'll get going. All right, designing personalized user interfaces. So thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, needless to say. I'm gonna somewhat make an overstatement to provoke, but to get us going here. And I'll say that interfaces are still designed for the average user, some mythical average user, and I'll ask, well, does this really make sense? There's so many forms of diversity or individual differences, and I think we are still missing out too much in the HCI community. So there's differences in age, there's differences in context of using interactive technology, a comfortable setting versus a situation like this, where this person is situationally impaired, trying to work on her phone while crossing a street. She needs some sort of eyes-free interface. We have individuals who have more permanent impairments, who need support. We have differences in motivation and differences in expertise, just to name some of them. And yet I feel like we're still often designing for somebody, quite capable in this type of context of use. So a research goal for my group, longstanding, still lots of work to be done to achieve it, is to characterize user diversity and accommodate this diversity through personalized adaptation. And by diversity here, I'm really talking about individual differences and supporting those. So there are some designs out there to support individual differences, and I'll just name a couple, but they largely are still quite inadequate. So there's your traditional settings where you can go in and set a particular interface to work the way you will need it to work. There's even settings specifically for accessibility and assistive technology. So if you can even find the right setting, it's a toggle. You turn it on or off as though you need the assistance or not. There doesn't seem to be anything in between. In terms of helping somebody build expertise, for example, which can be quite an individual trajectory, we have personalized recommendations. In the past, they haven't worked that well. To be fair, there's been more recent work in personalized recommendations. This at the lower corner is something called community commands that provides a personalized list of features that you are recommended to use based on your current usage of the software, but has never been tested in the field. So in one way or other, they all fall short. So in terms of this research goal, why should we really care? Why should we care about diversity? Well, really the benefit is to serve our existing users of interactive technology better than we're serving them today, possibly preventing software abandonment, for example. But ultimately, we want to open up new user bases and make technology more inclusive, help designers be more inclusive in their design choices. So a framing that I like to try and use in some of my work is called the curb cut effect. So what you're seeing here is, yes, indeed, a curb cut. At most corners out, you will see this indentation in the pavement, in the sidewalk, to enable, it was designed to enable people with mobility impairments in order to access the sidewalk more easily. But who uses this adaptation now? You know, it's people pushing strollers, people on skateboards, people on bicycles, people pulling luggage on wheels, and you name it. So the key point is that something that was designed for a particular population with impairments is now being used by many other individuals. So you'll see this come up a little bit in this work. So what are the high-level kind of research challenges with respect to designing personalized interfaces? These are the three high-level questions I put out, and I put in this design thinking figure just for those of you in the DFP courses. And the questions here approximately map to the stages in design thinking as follows. So how do we capture and characterize diversity? How do we design for diversity and individual differences? And how do we incorporate diversity in our system evaluations? So with that high-level framing, I am going to very briefly touch on a handful of projects that I've done over the last 10 years or so, many directed by my students, collaborators at UBC have been heavily involved, collaborators outside of UBC. And these projects tap into different aspects of personalization, different forms of diversity, and span the three research challenges that I just mentioned in one way or other. But I'm deliberately kind of going to lightly touch on a handful of projects instead of going deep into a smaller number. All right, so let's start with the first one, digital data preservation. So the question here that we asked at the outset is, how do people decide what data to keep or discard? Okay, and so what's the context for this? Well, we all know that storage is getting cheaper, whether it's storage on our laptops, storage, you know, on our mobiles. Cloud storage is virtually free if you're willing to give away all your data. And by data here, I mean not only pictures and documents, but text messages and apps and anything that you store digitally. So storage is getting cheaper. And so not surprisingly, the trend is that people are storing more and more and more data. So the question is, you know, how do people decide which data to keep and what to discard in this landscape? So in order to answer this question, we did a very rich qualitative study, you know, participants with a wide range of ages, occupations, and so on. And to cut right to the chase, what we found in terms of people's behaviors is there is really a spectrum in terms of their keeping and discarding behaviors. And it's got two extremes, which we'll use these labels. We use these labels, hoarding and minimalism. And these labels actually came from our participants. They're a little bit jarring. So one participant says, I'm a real hoarder. So on the one end, hoarding is associated with having lots of data accumulated through the years, but can be also challenging then to manage it. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have minimalism, which is keeping as little data as possible, regular cleanup to manage, but sometimes can be associated with anxiety for keeping up. The reality is we saw a real mix of these tendencies, with some people being stronger at one end and others at the other end, and some being a real mix. And it could very much depend on the type of data as well as the individual. So this was important to identify and then help us move towards figuring out how do we build some support for individuals to help them manage their data. And so as a first step towards building something, we came up with a design space that mapped out the area for design that we could create this tool in. And this design space came from the data that we collected in that first study, comes from the related work and our own personal experiences. So just to call out one dimension in this design space, temporality. So this reflects that a tool could be built to help you manage to discard your data retrospectively, looking back after you've accumulated that data. Not that surprising, but perhaps more novel is that you could decide prospectively in advance of collecting data that you will actually delete some data. So you'll see an example in a sec. So what we did then is we went on and we came up with 5 different design concepts that spanned this design space. And we built video prototypes for these 5 design concepts. So I'll just pick one to give you an example of what the prototype looked like, to see what the participants saw. And this is one that takes a prospective approach, so kind of deciding to delete in advance. So let's see if this is going to play good. Just wanted to check audio on that.
Michelle is preparing for a trip by plane. Before leaving, she decides to search for the flight company's application on the App Store. She finds it, and now she can decide to install it in the traditional way or only for a limited set of time. She decides to install the application for just 2 weeks, cause her trip is shorter than that, and she knows she won't need the application after the trip. Now the application is installed and it shows the expiration date, 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, the application is automatically deleted.
Okay, and so, like I said, just one of the design concepts. So we ran an elicitation study to understand how people reacted to the different concepts. And just as one key result from this was that there was, in fact, a real striking difference in how participants reacted to these design concepts. So for example, reactions to the temporary folder, which is very similar to the temporary app, ranged from enthusiastic, like I like that one a lot, to perplexed. Why would one want a temporary folder? To terrified. I would be terrified to put something in a folder that is going to be deleted. So we used all this towards designing what's called data dashboard, a system to support individuals and the individual differences. But I'm going to move on to some other projects to touch on other aspects of diversity. So, project 2, newcomers to feature-rich software. So, feature-rich software like word processors, web browsers are being used not only by adults today, they're being used by children and older adults. But it can be particularly challenging for newcomers, people who are first using these applications based on their diversity of experience in order to be able to use these applications effectively. And despite lots of learning resources out there on the web, research has shown that users commonly learn new applications through exploration, self-directed behavior, trial and error. It's also been shown that children can be very eager when they're learning and can be overzealous in terms of clicking on things and trying out. And by contrast, older adults have been shown to be fearful and too reluctant to try things out. So little was known before we ran this work on how interface exploration styles differed across the ages when looking at different age groups simultaneously in the same study with the same application. So we asked the question, do newcomers from different age groups explore an interface to a feature-rich application differently? So we took 3 different age groups and we chose Microsoft OneNote, which is moderately feature rich, and studied them under those conditions. What we did was we ran an experiment. We came up with 2 detailed tasks, an art task, a science task, with various sub-steps that were involved to exercise their ability to learn the interface. And in terms of data analysis here, we had coded video files for all the individuals. We had the video files, which we then coded. We came up with this detailed code book to try and understand the difference in behaviors, to see where we might see differences. So for example, an off-task selection was one of the ones that we came up with, where the user selects a feature relevant to irrelevant to the subtask that they're working on. So it's off task. Another example is a skim, where their user looks at a series of features on a submenu, but doesn't select anything from that submenu and then moves on. So lots of details there. Eventually we had the video files with all the coding and timestamps done for each of the participants. Lots and lots of analysis, data and stats and so on and so forth. But to cut to the chase, here are the key differences we saw in the behaviors. So in fact, counter to expectations, children actually explored the interface quite carefully. Interestingly, they struggled with right-click menus. Most of the children didn't find the context menus at all, which I think reflects a move away from the use of mouse, the right-click menu, or older adults struggled with sequence selection, so getting the right sequences of features in the right order. They repeated off-task selection, so they'd select the wrong thing and go in this kind of cycle. They cycle back, and then they repeat that. Significantly more often than we saw with children or adults. So they repeat the same wrong series of selections. They struggled with undo, again, more than the children and adults, such that they would undo a feature selection, but sometimes they'd undo content that they put into OneNote without realizing that they were undoing content. So this boundary between content and feature and undoing was problematic. Somewhat counter to our expectations, the older or the adults generally just performed well, and compared to some other work in the community showing that adults do also struggle with feature-rich software, we suspect that our tasks were not sufficiently difficult or OneNote not sufficiently feature-rich. So just to pick one of the issues that we saw, there are design implications that we look forward to trying out. For example, this off-task cycles that people had is a possibility would be that we might be able to use like a heat map of recent selections. So showing the user where they have just recently made a selection. So if they know that they've just been there recently and tried something out and it wasn't effective, they might, in this case, avoid what they've just done. And so this is a different use of heat maps than have traditionally been suggested in the literature. So more work on that in terms of supporting the differences that we saw. But keeping moving here, feature discoverability. So again, this is in the space of building expertise with software. But here, we're not looking, in this project, we're not looking at newcomers, nor was the goal to look for age effects. So what makes a feature successful? Well, it's successful if it's usable, if it's useful, but it's only successful if it's actually also discoverable. You can find it. And in this project, we explored the space of personalized proactive notification. So a notification is delivered based on an individual's own use of features over time. The system recognizes what might be a good feature for that user to learn. So we designed and implemented contextual feature recommender. What you're seeing here is a little recommendation that pops up If the user has been using Reddit through the web browser a series of times over a certain period, you get this recommendation that says, oh, enhance your Reddit experience. And you get the opportunity to learn more about this extension, which is a plugin that you can install, or you can install it directly from the notification. So let me just kind of show you a little like what this looks like. I'm going to start this video. The audio should be turned off here. The user is going up, and I think it's Amazon, and they go to Amazon just by typing in the URL. And they're going to do this a series more times. I'm going to skip ahead because you don't need to see them doing it, 4 or 5 times. So here, when they do it for the 4th time, you'll see the little notification comes up in the upper right-hand corner. And again, this is a plugin that's available, and you can click to say, well, why is this being recommended to me? Here, the user says, I want to learn more before I even consider installing this. So it goes directly to a page that tells you more information about that add-on, and then the user can go back to the notification and install it directly from there. And so then you see it goes in, the installation is made. Okay, so you get the idea. So the design challenge here was quite nuanced. We want to increase feature awareness, but without increasing annoyance. So this is a real challenge with notifications, even personalized ones, is that they increase annoyance. And so our ethos was to be very, very conservative. We thought, well, it's better to underwhelm and do no harm than to annoy. So a lot of design work went into even just the look of this notification and iterations, and it was iterated in part after a 4-week qualitative study, after which we ran then a 4-week quantitative study with our Mozilla partner, 3,000 users approximately. And so jumping just to some of the results to give you an idea here is over the 4 weeks in the big quantitative study, people on average received 4 recommendations per person, which is very low, but to not annoy. The actual adoption rate was 18%, which Mozilla said was the best that they had seen with any of their things that they've tried. Adoption here just means that the feature is used after it's recommended at least once, and a recommendation only comes if there's been no use of that feature. 73% said that they would keep CFR, so we were pleased with that. But just to keep us on our toes, one said, all this is okay, of course, so far. Clippy was invasive from the first, and it just got worse. So I was expecting the worst. If contextual feature recommender turns bad or my expectations change, I'll dump it in a heartbeat. It was released in Firefox in December 2018 with only 3 features. So our version had about 30 features in it. Again, trying to be really conservative. They were being even more conservative. And so here's the blog release from it coming out in December. CFR shown at the bottom there, but almost right around the same time, they had another release saying Mozilla Firefox adding setting to disable recommended extensions, so people could choose to do that. And yet still a year later, they were continuing to work on, they've been continuing to work on contextual feature recommender. So here's a blog post, and in fact, Kamyar Ardrukani, who's the lead, who's the master student who did this work, is named in this blog post working at Mozilla. And later in the blog post, they were showing variants of the design, which actually look very similar to what he did in his thesis. You can tell just kind of visually glancing at them. And they're continuing to do A/B tests on it. This is later in that same blog post. And saying that, oh, even for this one feature pin tab, there was a 50% higher adoption rate for those who got the recommendation. So stay tuned on that project. We'll see where that goes. Some of you may have received one of these recommendations if you use Firefox yourself. Okay, in my continuing whirlwind here, Customization through social support. So this is still getting at diversity of expertise and trying to help build expertise. So we just saw that feature discovery can come through personalized recommendations and that this can help build expertise. But what about building expertise when one's trying to craft a highly personalized artifact like a course? Some of you may be familiar with this. So we all know that learning management systems offer educators like many features, but creating an effective course is a steep learning curve. I can vouch for this, having been learning Canvas over the last few years. You know, and educators do really need to customize their courses. Here, you know, we could imagine a person, Pat, who's teaching both grades 9 and 10, teaching different subjects, experimenting with flipped classrooms in maybe some of their courses. They need to really Pat needs to dig into the application settings to tailor things, needs to adjust the course structure or navigation to set it up the way that they want. Might be wanting to install external plugins to make this happen. So what we know is that it's common for people, in order to achieve this, to seek social help from colleagues. So there's lots of documentation online, but some prior work of ours and others have shown that people really want help from their colleagues. And what's common is to seek out example customizations. For help, for inspiration. They want to see, what have you done? What could I try? What's, you know, and often the K-12 teachers that we worked with engage in exploratory learning. But the problem is they find it can be too risky for a live course. I mean, who's got a lecture going on later today wants to, oh, let me just try this out, and they've bunged their course up. So based on that, we asked this question. Well, if instructors could peek at and freely experiment, risk-free, with examples of their colleagues' courses, would it help them more easily customize their own course? So what we did was we built Customizer. Of course, it was the grad student, Leighton, who built this. And it's a platform for example-based customization sharing. There's 3 interfaces to it. So there's a discover, and I'm going to show you a 2-minute video in a second, but there's this discovery interface to see what customizations your colleagues have made. And then there's this exploratory interface where you can try things out risk-free, and I'll do the spoiler alert that this is what our participants in a usability study like best. And then, of course, you can author customizations. That's not been our main focus, but you have to be able to author them. So let me just show you, it's a couple minutes. And so you can see these different interfaces.
We implemented Customizer on top of the Canvas learning management system. Right now, we're looking at the homepage of our Canvas course, but it's pretty plain, and we want to find some ways to improve it. Luckily, we have access to the Customizer sidebar on the right-hand side of the page. Because we're on the home page of our course, by default the sidebar lists several possible ways we can customize the home page, and these are based on what other instructors have done to their home pages. We can see that each one of these customizations was shared by a different instructor, along with their own explanation for how or why they decided to customize their home page that way. Let's click on this first customization, shared by our colleague Alice. This opens the Customizer dialog, where we can browse all the changes Alice has made to her home page and related settings. Although Customizer automatically filters this list according to what page we're on in Canvas, we can click on the View All link at the top to see all of the customizations that Alice has applied to her courses. If we want to learn more about one of her customizations, we can expand more details, including her full written explanation, the complexity rating she gave it, and an overview of which Canvas pages are affected by this customization. Let's say we like the look of some of the customizations Alice has shared. If we want, Customizer makes it easy for us to import any of her customizations directly into our own course. But we might still be a bit hesitant about this, because we don't necessarily know the full impacts those customizations might have. It's possible that some of Alice's changes might break something that we've already set up, or that our students are already using. So instead, we can pick a few of Alice's customizations that interest us, and then click the button at the top that says Try for Selected Customizations. For us to try them out, Customizer will set up a safe testing environment that essentially duplicates our existing course's content and settings, but also applies those 4 customizations on top of this test course, and highlights all of the changes for us. So now we're free to explore how our course would look and feel if we were to import Alice's customizations. This exploratory mode is a central part of our design, allowing the user to experiment with other instructors' customizations to their heart's content without any risk of negative consequences. When we're done exploring, we can return to the list, pick the customizations we liked best, and import them into our course, safe in the knowledge that we understand what effects they will have. Customizer warns us before we modify our real course to ensure we don't make accidental changes to it.
All right, so as I said, spoiler alert, the key result was that we just ran a light usability study testing it out. And participants were particularly fond of the exploratory mode, which is similar to, in Canvas anyway, you can set up a guest or visitor mode for somebody to kind of peek into your course, but they won't have full instructor permissions there. So it's similar to that, but it gives them full permissions and applies it on top of their own existing course to see how it will look. So we're just about to start a field deployment, doing piloting this week on that project. So stay tuned there. All right, switching gears here, a different space, different form of personalization, different form of diversity altogether. So Rett syndrome is a genetic disorder. It occurs in about 1 in 10,000 people, predominantly women. And the women typically have a cognitive ability of about an 8-month-old infant. But what's very common is that people with Rett syndromes enjoy media like music or videos, but most are not able to use any assistive technology. So here it's about this designing a personalized interactive media system for people with this severe cognitive impairment associated with Rett syndrome. Our research questions are, how can we adapt a user-centered design approach for this population? And what toolkit might permit parents to easily configure systems for their daughters? So, cut to the chase. We worked with 5 families and we built, delivered, and evaluated 2 unique systems. On the left, you see a system we call the video button. And in this one, the daughter is able to just start and stop, toggle the video by using the large button you see under her right hand. And on the right hand side, you see the video bucket. And here the daughter is able to start and stop the video and choose a video by simply putting it in the red bucket that you see on the chair. An important note to say is that these individuals, these 2 women, love watching videos, but until this point, were never able to control start and stop a video on their own. In terms of evaluation, it's common working with people with impairments to take a case study approach, meaning that we work with one individual at a time. In this case, it was tricky because we were doing individual designs as well. To basically assess the impact of that in design on that one individual. So here we see what's going on in the graph, a trend that shows independence of the woman over time. It's the data just for the video button example, and there were 10 sessions, and we had this protocol where the participant was prompted after a short delay to see if they could unpause the video. So that was the task, unpause the video. So the circle shows prompted, this cross shows independently done, and we can see by the 9th session, the daughter was actually able to work on this independently. So these systems, video bucket, video button, they were built using Max MSP, some relatively straightforward coding, and tools, but these capabilities are beyond what most parents can do. So despite the fact that this is a pretty straightforward technical implementation, there isn't a plug and play architecture to support this. So that's one of the next steps in this research project. Okay, so last and certainly not least, eyes reduced document skimming. So now we're going to go from designing and evaluating for people with a permanent impairment to working with people experiencing what we call situational impairments. So we all know that there's been a dramatic increase in the auditory consumption of media of all sorts. But this goes beyond sort of music and podcasts. We're actually seeing an increase in the consumption of textual information. And there are relatively, handful of relatively new services that read text, like web pages, text document, news articles, but they typically read them right from the top to the bottom. And having tried many of them out, I can tell you right now, they're not great. Somewhat orthogonal to that trend, but at the same time, we're seeing this trend where people are skim reading or skimming as the kind of new normal for reading. So, and skimming just means that you're selectively reading from different parts of the text. Often you use it to help you decide whether you want to read the full text. So prior research has shown that there's substantial individual differences in terms of how people skim a structured document, whether they start and read the whole introduction and then just flip through, or flip through and read right to the conclusion. Lots of individual differences there. So our design challenge was to see if we could support skim reading auditorily. And the challenge in this is that audio is slow and linear. Reading can be a variable speed, but normal reading is linear. And skim reading is fast and nonlinear. So how do you support it with audio? Well, I mean, one might ask, well, why do you want to skim auditorily anyway? Well, you might be experiencing a situational impairment, and there's a bunch of contextual factors that can cause you to be situationally impaired. It could be that you're temporarily not able to read because you're on the bus and you get motion sickness on the bus, or you've been stressed and your eyes are just tired. You might have 15 conference papers that you have to skim on your way home on the bus to decide which ones you're actually going to spend time really reading, which ones are worth it. So I should say that when we started this work, we were asking whether we could design tool support that could support this auditory skimming. And we assumed we were going to aim for eyes free. So just total use of audio, no eyes. But what we did, we ran this formative study, and we started with sighted individuals, and we put them in this condition that they pretended that they were on the bus, as you can see in the picture. So they're experiencing these are individuals experiencing only a temporary impairment. And what we found is that they're absolutely at times compelled to look down at the text. And so what we realized is that if we are going to design a tool that's going to support both sighted individuals and people with visual impairments, that we need to support eyes reduced skimming rather than eyes free. And so the research challenge in this is really to determine how to leverage multimodal design elements, audio, visual, haptic, to help the user move seamlessly between, using their eyes and then looking away most of the time, when to look down and when to look away. So I'm going to show you a couple-minute video that just highlights a few of the design elements. Obviously doesn't capture it all, to give you a sense of how Skimmer works.
Skimmer predominantly supports eyes-free skimming. The user can perform sentence-level navigation for skipping unimportant sentences or re-listening to a missed passage with a lightweight eyes-free tap gesture.
Choose between 3 audience types for each of. Lastly, with the default settings, Snapchat.
Skimmer also supports sentence-level navigation using vision by traditional scrolling. When skimming, this can be useful for peeking at how far one is in the text and checking the remaining length of passages.
Of content and audience could.
Notice that Skimmer pauses as soon as the user navigates, because listening to and navigating at the same time induces high cognitive load. Also, paragraph level jumps support more granular navigation in both eyes-free and visual fashions.
To extend the literature in prior work,
We designed the way Skimmer narrates the written content to help listeners better understand complex and difficult texts. Written text and structural information are narrated in two disparate
their
voices.
privacy. Section 2. Background and related work.
This helps distinguish meta-information from verbatim content. A long list of items, bullet, or numbered items are read out in groups of 3 or 4 items at a time to help memory retention.
And the last 4 are Kim Kardashian, Catherine.
The user can access the entire structure of the document using Skimmer's overview feature. One can swipe to the overview and move around the sections, and then jump to a remote section by swiping back.
Suggest that this type audience
When a figure or table is referred to in the text, Skimmer gently informs the user with haptic feedback so they can look at the visual content. It facilitates navigating back and forth on demand.
more attributes can be used to
Caption of Figure 1.
the context.
The user has the choice to opt in and resume back to the main text, or ignore altogether and continue skimming the main text.
Okay, so we evaluated, did a preliminary evaluation of Skimmer versus VDR, which is sort of the best in breed read aloud type of app, not specifically designed for skimming, but designed for reading aloud on a bus, in fact, the B-line bus, so a very busy bus. And some of the key takeaways from that initial study was that it can in fact be used eyes reduced. People were able to navigate and listen and skim a document, respond to comprehension tasks using Skimmer. VDR did not work for this, not surprising, it wasn't designed for that. Overall, the design concept was well received, and the star feature was that the overview really supported the individual differences in how they wanted to navigate the document. And so the next steps in this research are definitely to work with individuals with visual impairments so that it will be able to be used fully with a redesign iteration, be able to be used eyes free. So both eyes reduced and eyes free is the target. And so at this point, I will wrap up and just do a quick recap. So I've talked about how understanding rich individual differences in digital data management has helped us design a tool to support diversity in this space, diversity of needs. I've talked about how age appears to impact the approach that people take when they're a newcomer to a software application, and some ideas for how we can offer personalized support for these differences in learning approach. I've talked about how to design personalized feature recommendations and how this improves feature adoption, and this may be beneficial for building expertise. Talked about how peek through form of customization, exploratory learning will hopefully lead many of us to create better course structures. Work to be done still there. We've talked about how designing individual media control systems for women with Rett syndromes is bringing us closer to some sort of plug and play toolkit architecture. So parents of these individuals may be able to create something that's custom for their daughter. And lastly, how multimodal eyes, multimodal support for eyes reduced document skimming should be able to help individuals who are experiencing situational impairment, and hopefully is a step towards helping people who are experiencing visual impairments. So on that, I will just end it off, say diversity is everywhere, and leveraging it should lead to more inclusive design. And of course, I have many, many people to thank. This work was huge collaboration with lots of folks, both at UBC, SFU, Manitoba, Mozilla, and the University of Oregon. And at this point, I will say thank you and happy to take questions.
So feel free, if you have a question, to unmute yourself and ask it, or you can use the raise hand function, or feel free to type your question into the chat box. I think Preeti has a question.
Yeah, great talk, Joanna. I have a question about Skimmer. It's a really interesting project. I was wondering, whenever I skim through a book and I'm reading a book, I usually use my peripheral information and the vision, like something I'm focusing on and something that is like in my vision that I'm not focusing on. And I'm like, okay, that looks interesting and I'm going to move on to that thing. So how can we translate that to auditory signal? I found it really challenging to even think about that. How do you think we can?
Super interesting question. Thank you for the question. We haven't, we don't have that supported yet, because right now what we've been focusing on is, because we're thinking about structured documents. This is work with Taslim, former master student, and Dongwook, who may be on this call here. We've been thinking about structured documents that where the individual differences in skimming that we've read about is really kind of fairly structured in the sense that, oh, well, people like to start, with title and then abstract and then intro and then jump to the conclusion. And that's why the overview has been quite useful in that regard. But I think your point about kind of seeing something in the periphery, like, oh, I might see a figure that looks interesting and I want to dive into that figure, is a different form that would be interesting to try and get across auditorily. So maybe there'd be this quick overview that's not, right now our overview is based on the headings and heading levels, but it could be some sort of overview that gives a sense of what all is in the document, and allowing people based on that. But I know what you mean, because you could be flipping through a book and you might just see something. Often it is a figure or a particularly catchy title that causes you to jump in, and how to do that auditorily is a interesting problem. So thank you.
Thanks, Preeti. I also wanted to mention that maybe we could, I'm glad that Preeti started as a student. I wonder if we can open the floor first to students to ask questions, and then we'll move on to the rest of the community.
Ashish looks like, may not be monitoring this, but I see a hand by Ashish.
Yes. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you for this great presentation. Like, this is a complete overview of your lab. And this is not just the overview, but like for an HCI aspirant like me who just graduated, it's like I got motivated to see that how focused your research work is. So I have a question which is actually related to the research work in total rather than a specific research study. So based on this talk, I realized that your focus is actually into user diversity and personalization. And when going through the presentation, I found that you have been dealing with different kind of users at place. Like in the first research, you were looking into diversity of different users. Then you went into a study where you were studying people with some kind of impairments like Rett syndrome, and then there were people with situational impairments. So I was thinking, like, with this particular goal in mind, like having to study user diversity and personalization, do you follow some kind of a technique to come up with the uh, ideas or problems, like which area you should find into, or this is more like a brainstorm or random?
Great question. And I will just say, I'm glad it looks like that all of the research in my lab is cohesive, because that means in part the illusion paid off, but it's trying to stitch it together and like, okay, what are the links between these projects? Okay, how big of an umbrella can I draw? It is tricky, and it doesn't all perfectly fit together, but I'm glad some of it looks like it does well. So, but to your question about how to come up with the research problems, a lot of the problems I would say that I come up with in my group and in collaborations with others in their group are related to things I personally experience or I see people close to me experience. So this notion, I walk a lot, and I listen to, just thinking about Skimmer, I listen to podcasts and stuff like that. But sometimes I'm like, I would love to go for, well, it's beautiful today in Vancouver, I'd love to go for a 3-hour walk today and read those papers, or and of course skimming is part of that. And so how can I leverage that? So some of my work is motivated by things myself. Of course, I've watched my own children and my parents trying to learn feature-rich software. So some of it is a personal motivation, and some of it, I mean, I'm not associated with anyone who has Rett syndrome, for example, so that doesn't come from a personal motivation, but one of the co-authors on that work does. And part of it, I am motivated by this notion of this curb cut framing, and how, if we design something that, what might a personalized media system like this do for people who don't have Rett syndrome? I mean, a media system like this may help an older adult in my life down the road when they are no longer able to operate TVs with 1 million buttons on them. And so it's a personal motivation to see how far we can push that inclusive design. But a crisper answer is that I don't have a specific formula for coming up with the research problems. Often they're opportunistic, or they touch on something that affects personally a collaborator I'm working with, whether it's a student or a faculty member.
Thanks, Ashish. I see there's a few questions in the chat here. So Joanna, I'm going to read out the first one for you. It's from Anna, one of our DFP students. She says, great talk. Love hearing how the projects are getting on. Her question is, when designing for differences between people, do you have to classify the differences before you can design for them, or is there another way to do it?
Yeah, another great question. I think it depends. So more recently in my work, like the first couple of projects, the digital data one and the minimalism hoarding and differences for based on age for newcomers, I'm trying to have this step in my research where I really do try and characterize the differences to see how deep those differences are. Before moving into the design phase, but I certainly haven't done that for all the projects. Like for the personalized feature recommendations, for example, I know going in that we know, this is joint work, we know going in that there are differences in terms of features that people use, and there's differences in expertise. And so we didn't do a pre-step that really characterizes the difference in users. Now, having said that, thinking back now, we did collect quite a lot of data with our Mozilla collaborator to see which features there is a lot of variation on, which is an indirect way of characterizing the user's expertise, and where we really thought there was opportunities for learning, useful features that could impact a broader group. So it varies is the answer to that.
Okay, we've got 2 more questions from students, and then I know that Mark had his hand raised earlier, so I think after that we will open the floor to everyone. We've just got a few minutes left, so here's a question from Ning. Can you share more lessons learned about how to strike a balance of personalization versus the potential cognitive load and other unintended outcomes? This question is particularly inspired from the browser extension study.
So exactly what you're getting at is the real design challenge in all of this. I wish I had a silver bullet answer for you, but I don't. But that maybe means I have still, lots of research left to do. And it's quite a classic issue in the sense that, oh, well, you can allow people under a user-controlled approach, say using a settings panel or whatever, to personalize for themselves, but therein is just the cognitive load of diving into those settings, which we know most people do as a last resort. And so this idea of recommending features, doing it very conservatively, is trying to help people get away from having to, because you could recommend settings, for example, as opposed to recommending the use of a particular feature, which we did. All I can say is it is a tricky balance to achieve, and I don't have a direct answer for it, except that knowing that that balance is there, because I've seen some designs that are super complex and I'm like, that's not going to fly. I've reviewed some and so on and so forth. Knowing that that balance is there is, I think, an important starting point when you go into the design, and trying to be conservative. So I'll just say a bit of a tangent, but it's interesting because when the first set of reviews for the contextual feature recommender came in, they're like, well, this isn't that impressive. People got 4 recommendations in 4 weeks on average. Like that's, but that was the point, to really be conservative there. So I will leave it at that and think about it some more.
So it's 1 o'clock. I understand if people need to run. Joanna, there's 2 questions left. I wonder, do you have time to stick around and answer them?
I'm fine.
Okay, great.
Thanks for those of you who were able to come out today.
So another question in the chat is, thanks so much for the talk. Any suggestions for specific digital design frameworks to consider when designing digital projects? Not sure if things like principles of universal design are perhaps too broad for some aspects of digital design.
Yeah, this is another great question. There is some in the space of universal kind of usability, designing for assistive technology, but I think they're like any high-level design guidelines. In many ways, they're hard to apply in your own specific case. That's what I have found. So the answer, in other people on the call might know more, but I can't think of sort of principles of universal design that have been that I directly go to. For example, when I'm working with my colleagues on Skimmer, it's like, oh, we have to remind ourselves of these principles and reference them, or we're going to fall short. In part, for me, I'm part of that assistive technology community, and so maybe a lot of it is just kind of infused from my participation in that community. But even in working with Taslim, the lead master's student on that, it's not like I was able to say, oh, you must read this and this is going to help you. Definitely reading and kind of thinking through this situational impairment and what can cause it was a helpful framing, but I don't see that as a design guideline, which I think is what you're asking for. So no.
And we also have a question from Atia, Atia, would you like to turn off your mic? And you can ask a question.
Yes, can you hear me now? Is it okay? Thank you so much for the presentation, and it was the excellent work that you're doing. It was really motivating, and I have a question about, specifically about the work that you were doing for the people with the Rett syndrome, and it was really, it kind of reminded me of I've been working on building a kind of controller for people having physical impairment, not like cognitive impairments. But when I was doing the research, I found that there's a one switch controller that that person that can't grasp and controller with multi buttons, that one switch will help them to control the game with only one button. And I was just curious to know if you have if you could study this one button video in controller for people also having mobility impairments. I mean, it could be useful for other a broad range of people, not only the people have a cognitive problem, but also the ones that have physical impairments. I mean, it's kind of similar to that, but that's gonna be useful for like video games, not like video, but it's yeah, that's
Yeah, so great question. The short answer to your question is no. I have not. I'm familiar with the one switch controllers. I have not studied them and tried to use them at all. I haven't studied them, so I definitely haven't studied them for purposes maybe for which they weren't intended, appropriated them for a different population. But I think it's a great thing to try. I will say that at a high level, one of the biggest problems with assistive technologies, which the switch controller, is considered, is high levels of abandonment. So one study quite a few years ago now, I think it was 70 or 80%. Anyway, it was so high that, it doesn't matter really what the number was. And so the problem is that people, I mean, all people are different from each other, but people with impairments, it's not enough to say, oh, this is a person with Rett syndrome, or this is a visually impaired person. They have high degrees of variation, individual differences, even amongst other people that are in their population. And so unless we can design solutions that can be adapted easily, non-technically, not through creating new manufacturing, and maybe, 3D printing will help us in this regard. It's not a space that I've tried, but it would be interesting to try. Unless we can create more customizable solutions, this abandonment is going to continue. It's very problematic. And so, the idea of the single switch, in fact, in the video button underneath, it was a big red button that we got from AbleNet, which is an assistive technology site. So I think there's ways to combine and kind of plug and play different elements to support individuals. But until we have that kind of plug and play architecture, it's going to be hard for people to test it out. I mean, researchers can do it. It's not something I've personally pushed too far on myself, but I appreciate the idea though.
Thank you so much.
Great. If Joanna, if you're okay with this, we have just one more question. Azada, I don't know if you're still on, but if you are, feel free to unmute yourself and ask one last quick question.
Okay, thank you. Hello, Joanna. Thanks for the great talk.
Nice to hear you.
Yeah, nice to meet you as well. I have a question about a skimming project. I was wondering who was your target group? Was just only native speakers or non-native speakers? Native English speakers or non-native English speakers considered as well? And if you considered both, how you consider differences between these two groups in your design?
Yeah. Oh, fantastic question. The short answer to that is we did not consider that dimension of diversity. But just you asking we considered a number of dimensions, but then had to kind of contain it. But I don't believe, I mean, Dongwook can correct me, but I don't believe we considered native versus non-native speakers as a key sort of dimension that we would try and recruit participants specifically. So he's shaking his head. Thank you, Dongwook. But just you asking the question is like, oh, geez, what a good idea, really important idea. And we did have, some dimension of under user control that I can imagine would impact native versus non-native speakers. Would be a very easy way to manage the speed at which the audio was read out. Non-native speakers may need a lower speed or higher speed at certain times, for example. But that's just an example where I can point to one of the design elements and say, oh, I think this might work for people who are non-native speakers. But we didn't go through the thought exercise of really thinking that through. And I think that's a really important dimension of diversity.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for the question. Great to hear your voice. Azadeh was one of the students in my class.
All right, I think that is all our questions for today. Joanna, I know Mark Gilbert had a question for you, but I'll maybe send him your email address so he can send it. He's off the call now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us. I would now like to invite all students to stick around and engage in a chat about future seminars.
Thanks, everybody.